Hi there, my name is Anton Tompert, and this is my presentation on groundwater depletion. So I want to begin with a story. This is John Wesley Powell. He became famous for taking a rowboat all the way down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in 1869, and this was the first government-sponsored trip for someone to go into the Grand Canyon. And this put him on the map to become the head of the U.S. Geological Survey because of his knowledge of the American West. And he did a lot of work surveying the land, and looking back, we can now see how forward-thinking a lot of this work was, and a lot of it just surrounded the importance of water. So one primary example of this is a map that he created where he proposed borders for Western states based on their watersheds, essentially how much water they had within that state. Another one that he created is this line on a map that essentially divides the arid west and the forested east, and we now actually know this is the 100th meridian, and this is what divides the west into the area where there is less than 20 inches of rainfall annually, which means that there is not enough rainfall to sustain agriculture on its own. And so he knew everything west of this line would require, all society west of this line would require water management in order to sustain society. And he was, fighting to spread this scientific message in an age of incredible irrational optimism, really bafflingly stupid ideas like, rain follows the plow myth, which is the idea that if we would create farms and open up the land, that aerated soil would go up and create rain. It would attract rain. Other ideas like train smoke and dynamite causing rain were also really popular. And people would, develop railroads and blow things up with dynamite and create farms. And then there was just unseasonably good weather in that period of manifest destiny when we were, moving west. And just coincidentally, we had good weather. And so they thought, if we are developing railroads and we have dynamite and we are creating farms, the rain will follow. And, John Wesley Powell essentially spent his entire career trying to dismantle these lies. And in 1893, he was set to give a speech to Congress about development in the West. And he actually set aside that speech to speak from the heart and warn them how short-sighted they were being and how incredibly unsustainable their plans were for the West because of their lack of consideration for natural resources. And they booed him off stage. They yelled at him. He lost his position as head of the USGS. He sacrificed himself to give that warning, and we fully ignored it. And a generation after he died in 1934, there was the famous Dust Bowl. Washington, D.C. found itself surrounded by 10,000-foot clouds of dust. And no one knew what this was, but we later found out that plowing, excessive grazing, drought had killed off so much plant cover in Nebraska and Kansas, 1,000 miles eastward from Washington, D.C., and the wind had swept all that dry soil and created this massive dust storm that headed east to D.C. And this just shows, this is incredibly symbolic of the role of arrogance that we had surrounding natural resources in our expansion to the West. So now with that story, we can take a look at groundwater and the science behind it. So almost a third of fresh water on Earth is groundwater. And practically all of this groundwater is stored underground in aquifers, which are these permeable underground rocks. So rainfall essentially sinks into porous land, seeping down underground, and that water will build up underground over the course of hundreds, sometimes even thousands of years, building these massive underground, essentially water savings accounts. And as you can see in this figure that we have here, groundwater is divided into three different zones. There's the zone of aeration, which is the top layer of soil before there's like a lot of water that develops. Then there's the zone of saturation, where there's a lot of water that builds up in these huge pools. And beneath that is the waterless zone. So you can see that the zone of saturation is kind of the most important because that's where the majority of the water is stored, and it's sandwiched between these two layers where there isn't any water. And so to access this water underground, we dig up wells. That's the tool that we use to access this water, is wells. And by building the wells, we can use pressure to essentially pump up the water from underground. But however, we tend to pump out water out of aquifers much faster than it builds up, because we need this rain to seep down underground and build up in the aquifer. And that takes a really long time because it takes a long time for the rain and the water from rainfall to seep all the way down into these deep underground aquifers. And we can pump up water like crazy as much as we want, and a lot of places are really reckless with that. Prime example of this is the Ogallala Aquifer. It's the biggest aquifer in the U.S., spans 8 states, and the farming in Kansas, Texas, and Colorado especially is entirely dependent on the Ogallala Aquifer because rainfall is too scarce to support industrial agriculture on its own in this area. And the Ogallala Aquifer supports 30% of all U.S. crop and animal production in the entire country. And within the area, it provides 80% of the drinking water. So it's incredibly important, but as you can see on this map, the aquifer is being drained in most places faster than it can be replenished. You have these deep shades of red and orange, especially through Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and Texas, where we are just draining it. And it's very simple math. It's just subtraction. It's not, miraculously building up. And once it's drained, the aquifer is estimated to take 6,000 years to replenish. So this is an incredibly historied resource that we've been given with really deep roots, and we are totally disregarding that for the use of water. And that's how we found ourselves in our current situation. Water overuse is a global problem. It's happening around the world. India, China, Pakistan, countries in the Middle East, Africa, Australia, these are all places with their own groundwater crises. And not only does this, impact irrigation in those areas, this inevitably impacts global food trade. I mean, we saw with the war in Ukraine how, they grew a lot of sunflowers, and sunflower oil happens to be in almost everything. And so a war in Ukraine raises food prices in California. And this is just that on a much larger scale, given how widespread this problem is. For this presentation, though, we're just going to focus in on the U.S. And for the U.S., we currently depend on groundwater for 50% of irrigation and more than a third of the nation's drinking water. And according to the New York Times, where they had a report where they looked at over 80,000 wells across the nation, nearly half of the wells have declined significantly over the past 40 years as more water has been pumped out than can be replenished. And in the past decade, 4 out of every 10, so that's 40 sites, have hit all-time lows. So put really simply, where we get 50% of our irrigation for farms and a third of our drinking water, massive declines, and we're hitting all-time lows in these sources. So what does this mean for us? Just look at the Colorado River. This is a picture of Lake Mead, one of, I think, maybe actually the biggest reservoirs on the Colorado River. And it's hitting historic lows. That same Colorado River that Powell rode down that made him famous, it doesn't even make it to the ocean anymore. It dries up in Mexico. And lower water levels in rivers not only means a shrinking water supply for regions, for the region's farmers and residents, but also lower output of hydroelectric generated power, because dams can't generate as much power if they don't have as much water running through them. And this is just getting worse with climate change. There are shrinking snowpacks, which means shrinking rivers, which means less water for farms from rivers, which means more pumping, which just makes the problems worse. And this is what we refer to as the water pumping, or sometimes climate trap. In California, we're becoming more dependent on water as a resource that we know it's limited. It's quickly depleting, and we're just becoming more and more dependent on it. And, there's a reason we do this. Using irrigation and pumping up water to give to your crops gives you better yields. Corn, for example, if it's irrigated, you get twice as much corn per acre than if you just depend on rainfall. And, that's not to be ignored. Twice as much. You're making twice as much as a farmer if you're using irrigation. But farms who have run out of water, and some who are environmentally conscious, very, very small proportion, have switched to dry land farming, which means they rely only on rainfall. But that's become less stable with climate change. There's less stable precipitation. Farms in Wichita, Kansas have shut down because the wells have run dry. Arkansas produces half the rice in the country, is following suit. Their aquifers have hit just 10% of capacity in some places, 10%. California, increasingly common storms that we've had, which are really intense. they're so intense that they actually don't have enough time to seep into the ground. They just we have these floods and they wash into rivers that wash into the ocean. And so aquifers aren't being replenished because this water isn't seeping into the ground. Colorado is next in line. They have zero restrictions on aquifer preservation. They do not even measure it. Kevin Rain, who's the Colorado official in charge of allocating the nation's groundwater, lawmakers haven't even given him the authority to track how much water is in their portion of the Ogallala aquifer. So they don't even know. They just have to guess in the dark. So eventually this means higher food prices as more farms shut down when they run out of groundwater. And for some places, they even have to shut down tap water altogether because overpumping can contaminate drinking water supplies. This actually happened in New York. And, it's easy today to forget how important groundwater is, or water is, given how many of us just have food that shows up in grocery stores where we never give a second thought to how it ends up on the shelf. But this is the basic message that Powell tried to get across to lawmakers. No water, no life. Fortunately, here's a super long list of promising solutions to the problem. Some are difficult, others aren't. We can start with the biggest one, drip irrigation. This is a irrigation system that's far more water efficient than the large-scale sprinklers that a lot of farms use. The problem, it's expensive and a hassle to replace. The answer, we can use subsidies, tax credits, other financial incentives to get farmers to make the switch. Desalination, turning salt water into drinkable water. It's really expensive and time-consuming. We have research and development that can help us make it cheaper and faster, and we absolutely do need to be expanding on this. Just the way we treat aquifers, they're not like checkings accounts. That's the best way to think about it. They're these massive savings accounts, this inheritance that has been handed down to us over hundreds of generations. These are incredibly old resources, and we're spending it like we just got a paycheck. These are savings accounts. They're not checkings accounts, and we need to be looking into other ways where we can build up our checkings account as opposed to blowing through our savings, which is the aquifers. Wastewater treatment. This is another great one where we can treat wastewater to actually have it be used for personal and agricultural use. There's a bit of an ick factor, but wastewater treatment is actually making cleaner water than some of the water sources we already have. Limiting urban development. You can see Phoenix is a great example of this. They've limited more development because the houses that already have permits and are already being built don't have enough water to water their lawns and have tap water. And, having a lawn in Phoenix is as insane as having palm trees in Alaska. This is just something that we cannot be used to. This cannot be the normal, especially in this era where we're now having a crisis with water use. Education. People have to understand and respect water conservations and policies that promote it. Just remembering, the basic thing where it's like, oh, turn off the water when you're brushing your teeth. Things like that. People have to understand this has to be a cultural change, that we have to know that water is not unlimited and just ours to use as we please. It's a limited resource that we all share. It's a public resource. Investing in repairs to fix leaks in our distribution systems. We're actually already doing this with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is great. Using gray water and recycled water. Gray water is water from sinks, showers, washing machines. We can use this to irrigate lawns and flush toilets, saves water and money for people on their water bills. That's another great solution. Rainwater capture. These are literally tanks that just capture rainwater. This promotes self-sufficiency, and residents who use it, they become more aware of the water they have as a natural resource, and it gives residents more water that's free to use, especially in drought-prone places like California. And this reduced the risk of floods by capturing stormwater runoff. Water rights. Our water rights system is unbelievable. It's basically calling dibs. Whoever gets to water first has the right to use it as they please, unregulated. This is entirely outdated, treats water like oxygen, needs to be revisited. Fortunately, Stanford actually has a project where we're digitizing the water rights documents that we have, which are basically these loose, decades, sometimes century-old pieces of paper that say, oh, this person has this much water that they can use. But there's more rights to water than there is water. Just let that sink in for a second. That is a path, that is a guaranteed path to running out of water that we have. So updating our water rights laws, absolutely must do. Shifting away from meats. This is, not forever, not getting rid of meat. Good luck prescribing veganism to the whole world. But just, having a day or two in the week where you don't eat meat. This is something that personally everyone can do to help reduce the demand that we have for water, because it's not even the livestock themselves, it's the crops that we grow to feed them. Alfalfa primarily. The growth of alfalfa uses 3 times the amount of water from the Colorado River than residents in all of Colorado. It's incredibly water intensive and demanding. So there's a lot of solutions here, and this transitions into this conclusion that I have, and I want to end here with this map. And this is the map that Powell developed with the Western states' borders based on watersheds in that given area. And this is to avoid water wars that we're having now. And Powell understood, this map shows that Powell understood that society in the West depends on the intelligent management of water, because we're not just given it to us naturally by rainfall. And, I'm not proposing that we change our borders to look like the western half of the U.S. melted after being left in the sun for too long. But just looking at this map forces us to think about, how strange it is that a lot of states are just perfect squares. And our borders are straight lines. We create these political boundaries and borders that are based on arbitrary measures devised by the human mind. In the West, though, nature has no respect for borders. We depend on nature for the most fundamental ingredient, water, not just for society, but for life. And when D.C. found itself engulfed in that 10,000 foot cloud of dust, the irrational optimism that characterized American politics was swept away in that storm. And now we in the West find ourselves engulfed in a 10,000 foot wall of delusion. But we have the solutions to create a door to get us out of that wall of delusion. But can we manage to open it? And it's up to us. So thank you.